So as we mentioned, we were at Shindig last week, and so we took a little bit of a break in our rather lengthy series called Set Apart on the book of Romans. We've been doing this for quite a while. Way back in March we started. We're going to be going through Labor Day weekend, so we've got a little over a month left of this. So hopefully you guys have been able to dig in and stick with us as we're doing this. But today we're going to be moving into chapter 11, which is kind of the conclusion of a thought or a discussion that Paul has been having for a couple of chapters. Right? The Bible, it's got all these nice chapters and verses for us, but it turns out that that's not originally what the writers were doing. They didn't break it down that way, so sometimes you get these thoughts or these discussions that go well beyond a chapter or a paragraph, and so we've been in this couple of weeks here, 9 through today, and 11 is kind of one thought or one discussion that Paul is having, and so we're going to conclude that today, that part of it today. And so just to kind of catch you back up, if maybe you missed the last couple of weeks, I'm going to give you a bit of a refresher on chapter 9 and chapter 10. So in chapter 9 of Romans, we read about God's sovereign choice in salvation. Paul explains that God's mercy and his election are based on his own will. Right? It's not anything that we have done. It's his own sovereign will, his grace. And it's not our effort, it's not our lineage, which is important for the Israel people, right? They were banking on their heritage as Israelites, and Paul tells us in chapter 9, no, that's not what true Israel is. It's your faith that makes you part of Israel. And then in chapter 10, a couple weeks ago, Paul highlighted the necessity of faith for salvation, and he deals with Israel's failure to respond to God's righteousness and God's call for them to be righteous as well. And Pastor Zach ended the message a couple weeks ago. Last time, chapter 10 ends on kind of a downer, he said, right? The very end of chapter 10, Paul is quoting Isaiah 65:2 about Israel, and he says, "All day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people." And that's how chapter 10 ends. I think that maybe even is relevant for us today in 2024, right? God is continually reaching his hand out to disobedient people. And so we're going to start chapter 11 with kind of this tension that Paul has been building up in these previous chapters. Will Israel's sin and stubbornness defeat the purpose of God? Kind of sounds like an intro to next week's episode, right? On next week's episode, will Israel's stubbornness and sin defeat the purpose of God, or will God find a way to deal with the situation and keep his promises? Well, good news, you don't have to wait till next week. We're going to talk about that today. We're going to answer that question. In the very beginning of chapter 11, Paul says, "I ask, then has God rejected his people?" So he's building up this argument, he's building up all this stuff, and so the conclusion that he thinks people might come to is that God has rejected his people, Israel. And so he asks the question, has God rejected his people? And so before we move on with how Paul answers this question throughout the rest of the chapter, I want you to think about why that's such an important question. I'm going to ask something that I'm pretty sure I know the answer to, which is always a good move to ask questions you know the answer to, because it's a good, safe move. But have you ever experienced somebody breaking a promise? Right? We all have, right? We've all had somebody promise us something, and that promise has been broken. And what happens when that promise gets broken? That person loses some credibility, right? Maybe you don't trust them as much the next time they make a promise to you. Maybe it damages your relationship because you just don't feel like you can count on that person to come through with the things they say that they're going to do. The more often you break promises, the more likely it is that trust is going to be gone, right? It's just going to be whittled away and gone. And so Paul's question here at the start of chapter 11 is an important one because the answer to the question points to who God is. It reflects his character. It reflects his faithfulness. Is God trustworthy? Now, you guys probably haven't thought a whole lot about whether God has abandoned Israel or not, right? Paul's talking a couple thousand years ago. It's kind of a different environment in church at that time. Right? So we're probably not as close to this. We're probably not thinking so much about, has God abandoned Israel? But you may have wondered, you probably have wondered, is God faithful? Can he be trusted? Is he going to reject me or abandon me? When we read Scripture, we've got to be careful to not make it mean things that it doesn't mean. Right? We live in a time and a culture where we like sound bites, and we take these little pieces of things, and we oftentimes will take Scripture out of context, or we'll read a couple verses or a paragraph, and we won't read the whole context and get the full meaning, and we try to make things apply that really don't apply. All right, so we got to be careful with that. We've got a culture that says this phrase, which drives me crazy, my truth. My truth is this, right? Your truth is that. Truth is truth. If it's true, it can't be true for me and false for you, right? And so we've got to be careful with how we handle Scripture. And Paul in chapters 9 through 11, he's primarily talking about the Jews. And so this question in verse 1, has God rejected his people, is about the Jews, right? He's talking about Israel. When he's asking this question, he's not talking about us. He's talking about Israel. And so we've got to just remember that and have that kind of frame our context as we go through this chapter. But the answer to that question still has ramifications for us. If God isn't faithful to keep the promises that he made to his chosen people, then can we really trust him to keep promises to us? And so when Paul asks the question, has God rejected his people, he's asking, does God keep his promises? And like he frequently does, he answers his own question, right? Paul's always kind of having this discussion with himself. And so he answers his own question emphatically, by no means. God has not rejected his people. God keeps his promises. And so like I said, in the rest of the chapter here, he goes on to give his evidence for that. So we'll get into that. I'm going to read Romans 11, 1 through 6. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the Scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. And so the first evidence that Paul gives for his claim that God has not rejected his people is himself. Paul is the evidence, because Paul is an Israelite. He's descended from Abraham, yet he's a follower of Jesus. And like Paul, most of the first believers in Jesus were Jewish, right? Jesus was Jewish. He's the Jewish Messiah, and he came to his people, and many rejected him, right? They ended up killing him. But the first believers were largely Jewish. And so Paul's argument that if he, a Jew, is saved, then clearly God has not rejected his people. And then Paul then brings up Elijah. Now Elijah, this was a time of massive disobedience by the people of Israel. Elijah was on the run. He was scared for his life, right? He thinks he's going to get killed, so he's trying to escape. And he stops to rest, and he cries out to God, kind of a little whiny here, if we're going to be honest, right? Your people have been killed, your altars have been destroyed, and I'm the only one following you, God. And so let's pause for a second. That's pretty presumptuous, right? I mean, Elijah's assuming that he's the only person in all the land that is still following God. But we kind of get like that too, don't we? Maybe you're the only one in your family who's following Jesus. Maybe you look around at work or at school or just in our society and you just feel like, man, is there anybody else following Jesus? or am I the only one? And so what does God say to Elijah? He says, Elijah, I have kept 7,000 men for myself that are still following me. You don't know what's going on, Elijah. You're sitting there all by yourself. You think that, oh, poor me. I've got 7,000 people that I've got following me still. And so despite what it looked like and felt like to Elijah, he wasn't alone. And I want to encourage you that you aren't alone either. I mean, look around this morning. We are gathered here this morning to worship God together. And so as we go out into our lives the rest of the week and it feels dark and it feels lonely and it feels like, didn't anybody follow God anymore? Yes, people do still follow God. We are evidence of that. And God is saying to Elijah, and Paul is using that as his evidence, there's still a remnant. And again, he's talking about Israel. He's talking about the Jews. There's still a remnant of people who are following me from my chosen people. And so with this, I want to give you a little bit of a plug. We talked about it during the announcements, but it is so important to be in community with other believers, to be encouraged, to be strengthened, to be prayed for, to be challenged to grow, to keep going. And like I said earlier, we're going to be launching small groups in a couple of months. I want to encourage you to get into a small group. I know it's not easy. It's never convenient. Like the night comes and you're like, I've got so many things to do. I'm tired. I just want to go to bed. I don't want to clean my house. I don't want to cook dinner. I don't want to do all of these things. And it can be inconvenient and it can be hard, but it's so worth it. Encourage each other. Let other Christians and brothers, or sisters and brothers into your life. God reminded Elijah that he wasn't alone. And Paul says that it's still true, that God still has a remnant chosen by grace. It's the grace of God that ensures that there's always going to be a remnant of his people. And that remnant is evidence that God has not rejected Israel. And Paul continues, read with me verses 7 through 10. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. So verse 7 points us back to what Paul has been saying in chapters 9 and 10. A little refresher, a little reminder in chapter 9:31. But Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. In chapter 10, verse 3, being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Chapter 9, verse 6, for all who are descended from Israel, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. Despite seeking righteousness, the vast majority of Israel failed to obtain it because they tried to do so on their own terms. Right? So it wasn't that they weren't trying to seek God, right? They were zealous for God. They were trying to seek God, but they did it wrongly. So your zealousness isn't what gets you to God. Right? They were trying to seek God, and they did it wrongly, so they actually didn't find it. So the majority of Israel had rejected Jesus. The majority of Israel was not saved. But he says the elect have obtained it, talking about righteousness, but the rest were hardened. Now, if you read through the Old Testament, we get a lot of language, a lot of discussion about hardening. Right? We talk about Pharaoh. We got all these examples of hardening and God hardening hearts. And it can get a little confusing, maybe even sounds kind of mean on God's part. And I think there's a little bit of a kind of a chicken and the egg aspect to God's hardening. And while I don't think I can fully explain it, I can't even fully understand it, I want to try to give a little bit of clarity. So Timothy Keller, great pastor, passed away somewhat recently. he calls the hardening that Paul is talking about here a judicial hardening. And he defines that as punishment for having a proud heart that rejects the message of grace. So a judicial hardening. In verse 8, Paul is quoting both Deuteronomy 29:4 and Isaiah 29:10. And there are lots of other passages, like we talked about in the Old Testament, New Testament, that talk about this idea, these eyes that do not see and these ears that do not hear. And the basic idea is this, that as we continue to ignore God, as we continue to reject His grace, we develop this callousness. We develop a hardness to Him and to His Word. And the more that we continue to ignore and reject Him, the harder it is to respond to His grace. So then Paul goes on to quote Psalm 69, verses 22 and 23, which was originally somewhat of a curse that was directed at Israel's enemies. And then Paul kind of flips it onto the Jews. And Timothy Keller, again, he calls this a retribution or a punishment that exactly fits the crime. Rejection of God ultimately leads to rejection from God. It's a natural consequence. They're getting the consequences of their actions. Right? So God hardens their heart, but they were hardened to God first. Right? Let's continue on. Verse 11. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now, I am speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as firstfruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. So Paul essentially repeats his question from verse 1. Is it too late for the Jews? Like, has God rejected them? Is it too late? Are they just out of luck now? Are they beyond recovery? And again, he answers emphatically, by no means. He then goes on to say it's all part of God's plan. It's all part of what God is trying to do. The Jews' rejection of the gospel is what actually brought salvation to the Gentiles. And most of us here, probably all of us here, are not Jews, right? That makes us Gentiles. And we are here today largely due to the rejection of God by the Jews. So you think about it in the New Testament, what's the pattern, right? After Jesus dies, He's resurrected, He ascends. The pattern from then on that we see in the New Testament is that the disciples, they go to the synagogues, they preach the good news. The Israelites reject the good news, sometimes very harshly. They drive out the disciples, who then take the message to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles believe. All right, so God used the rejection of His people, Israel, to reach the Gentiles. If the Jews had heard the message and they had received it, they had accepted Jesus, then the apostles wouldn't have had the need or the motivation to move on to the Gentiles. They'd been like, sweet, mission accomplished. Everybody believes, we're good. Let's just sit in our little circles. Let's all praise Jesus, and we're good. But God used the rejection of the Israelites to reach the Gentiles. Evangelism is hard. It's scary sometimes. We don't want to face rejection. We don't want to be made fun of. We don't want people yelling in our face. Some countries, you got obviously the possibility of being killed. And so it's hard. But God uses that for His purpose and for His glory. God doesn't call us to be successful. He calls us to be obedient. right? So if the apostles had decided, man, I preached this message to the Jews and they rejected it, I'm just going to pack up my stuff and go home, we wouldn't be here right now, right? He's not calling them to success. That's not what he was asking for. He was asking them to be obedient, to spread his word. And if they're not going to listen, take it to somebody else. And so I want to ask you, how might God be using your failures and your weaknesses to grow you and to reach others? And Paul adds at the end of verse 11 that not only is it God's plan to use Israel's rejection to reach the Gentiles, he's using it to make the Jews jealous, it says. He's trying to make Israel jealous. Israel was given all of these promises by God. They were seeking him, as we talked about before, but they were doing it wrongly, and so they didn't actually receive what they were seeking. And now the Gentiles, they're coming in, and they're receiving these promises. These things that were promised to Israel, the Gentiles are now getting. And Paul says that's going to make Israel jealous. And so here's another question for you guys, for you individually, and for us as a church. Would non-believing Jews, or just non-believing people in general, would they look at your faith? Would they look at your relationship with Jesus and be jealous or envious of what you have that they don't? And we think of jealousness usually as a negative thing, right? But in this case, it's a good thing, right? I mean, God says in the Old Testament that he's jealous for his people, right? So it can't always be a bad thing if God's jealous, right? And so look at your life. Did non-believers see what you have in your relationship, and do they think, wow, I want to have that? And then us as a church, as Crosswater, are we creating a community that looks like the fulfillment of what God had commanded and what God had promised, what he had called Israel to be? Are we as individuals and as a body of believers here at Crosswater living out the commands of God in such a way that it draws non-believers around us to want what we have? Are we displaying obedience to God and to his word? Are we showing unity? Are we showing grace and love with one another and with the people outside of these walls? Paul says not only is the rejection of and by the Jews part of God's plan to bring salvation to the Gentiles, but the Gentiles putting their trust and faith in the Jewish Messiah, right? They're thereby receiving his promises. It's all part of God's plan. God's not surprised by it. He's not caught off guard by it. It's his plan to bring people to him. And so because we as people, we tend to give ourselves a little too much credit, right? We're pretty easy on ourselves most of the time and maybe a little harder on other people. So Paul brings a little bit of a warning here to the Gentiles. Verse 17. He says, "But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree?" So, what is he talking about? There's a tree, there's some roots, you're getting cut, you're being grafted. What is happening? So he gives this illustration of an olive tree. He wants to set the stage for the warning that he is giving to the Gentiles. The root is what Paul has been teaching throughout this letter. It's justification by faith. Right? That's the root. So the faith of Abraham and anyone after him who followed God by faith. Right? That's the root. We're justified, we're saved by grace alone, through faith alone. The natural branches are the descendants of Abraham. That's Israel, right? God's people. And the broken branches are the non-believing Jews. So the people in Israel that did not follow in faith, right? But by their own efforts, whatever the case. So those branches get cut off. And so what's left on the tree is true Israel, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, chapter 9. True Israel is those who have come to Jesus through faith. That's what's left on the tree. Now, the wild olive shoots are the Gentiles who have been grafted on to this olive tree. Among the branches that were remaining, in place of the branches that were cut off, right? And so they're now sharing this nourishing root of the olive tree. Now, I'm not a horticulture expert, but grafting is when you take a shoot or a branch from one tree and you attach it to another tree. It then becomes part of that tree, right? It starts drawing the nutrients out of that tree, and it adheres itself with some help to that tree, right? And it becomes part of that tree. And so again, not an expert, but a shoot or a branch cannot graft itself to the tree. Like, you've never seen a tree cut itself off, or a branch cut itself off and move on to a different tree. This doesn't happen, right? And so what Paul is wanting to remind the Gentiles of, he's saying, you didn't attach yourself to the tree. God has grafted you on. It is by grace that you are saved. And we tend to lose sight in our role in the process. We sometimes blatantly, sometimes subtly, we think and we act as if we're chosen because of how good and smart and clever we are. We think that we're somehow deserving. We forget that we came to Jesus because he called us. And it was his grace that brought us, and we accepted that grace. And then we lose sight of that, and we think, oh, look at how amazing I am. I have the answers. I know Jesus because I'm so amazing. We become prideful when we become judgmental. And so Paul has reminders and warnings for the Gentiles in dealing with non-believing Jews. And I think that, again, he's talking to the Gentiles, he's talking about the Jews, but we can learn from this as well in how we interact with non-believers. And the first thing he says as a warning, do not be arrogant toward the branches. We are not any better than non-believers. The only difference is that we've put our faith in Jesus. And then he says we are to remember that the root supports you. It's not the other way around. You are attached to the root through the grace of God. You are supported and nourished by him. You are not doing the heavy lifting. And Paul talked about it during communion. It's like we're not put here to defend God. We're not put here to seek justice, or not seek justice, but give justice. Like, we're not the judge, right? We're not doing the heavy lifting. God did the work. And so if remembering who supports who doesn't remove your arrogance, Paul reminds the Gentiles that the branches were cut off due to their unbelief. Therefore, he says, stand fast through faith. When we become prideful, we tend to forget what got us here. We start to do things on our own. We tend to think that we've got all the answers, that we're right and they're wrong, whoever they is. We tend to move towards works and to legalism. And Paul is saying, don't fall into that same trap of unbelieving Israel. Right? Because you can, with lots of zeal and fervor, do things wrongly. And so he's saying, don't fall into that trap, but hold on to your faith in Jesus. Remember what brought you in. It was him. It was not you. Hold fast to that. And he reminds them again, because we need the reminder probably a second time, do not become proud, but fear, he says. If God will cut off the natural branches, don't think that he won't cut off the unnatural branches. And he's got one more reminder, one more warning. He says, note the kindness and severity of God. Again, unbelief results in being cut off. Now, some of you might be saying, well, what about once saved, always saved? Right? We've probably all heard that. Once saved, always saved. How can I be cut off? Well, so these last two reminders, these warnings, they're not saying that we can lose our salvation. They're really more about identifying counterfeits. J.D. Greer, in his study on Right Now Media for the book of Romans, he says this: once saved, always saved is true, but so is once saved, forever following. True faith will look like continuing to put your trust and your faith in Jesus. It will look like being obedient to him. It'll look like striving to be holy, like we've been talking about this whole year. It will look like love and grace and humility and not like arrogance. Now, it doesn't mean we're not going to have times where we slip up or we forget, right? But if your life doesn't look like love, grace, humility, obedience ever, probably a good indicator that you're not saved, that you're not on the tree. The Gentiles did not earn their way, right? They were grafted in by the grace of God, and the broken off branches can be grafted back in, he says, right? So if it's faith, if it's belief that grafts you on through the grace of Jesus, right, then it's not too late for the Jews. They can be grafted back in. So then Paul turns his attention to kind of the future of Israel, what things are going to look like in the future, both at that time and still even now in the future. So let's finish out 25 through 32. Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they too have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. There's a lot of complexity in these last several verses, and unfortunately we don't have time to fully explore all of that, but Paul's continuing to answer his earlier question. Has God rejected his people? And he maintains, no, he has not. God has not rejected his people. And he says, to keep you from being wise in your own sight, so again, kind of this arrogance, he says, I'm going to reveal this mystery to you. And the mystery is that Israel's hardness is not permanent. There's been a hardening, but it's not going to last forever. It's going to continue, he says, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so we continue to see God's sovereignty here. We continue to see his plan. He used the Jews' unbelief to reach the Gentiles, and he is and will use the Gentiles' belief to reach the Jews. And at some point, he says that all of the Gentiles that are going to come to faith in Jesus will do so. All right, so at some point in the future, every Gentile that's going to trust in Jesus, like we reach that point. And then he says, quoting Isaiah and Jeremiah, that a deliverer will come, which is Jesus, and take away their sins. And he says right before he quotes those, he says that all Israel will be saved. There's a lot of confusion. There's debate on what does Paul mean when he says all. It's likely that he does not mean all as in every Jew without exception. There's a professor and a scholar, his name's F.F. Bruce. He says it like this. He says, all Israel is a recurring expression in Jewish literature where it need not mean every Jew without a single exception, but but Israel as a whole. So like the majority. And so Paul frequently uses it to mean a majority of Israel compared to the minority of believing Jews. And so ultimately, he's looking forward to a massive increase. Like I said, there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of discussion about what that really means. How much is the majority? What's massive? I don't know. I don't think any of us know. But ultimately, looking forward, there's this massive increase of Jews that are coming to Jesus. And he's saying that even though they are your enemies now in regards to the gospel, God's not done with them yet. And then at the very end here, at 32, everybody has been disobedient, right? It's this reminder that we've all been disobedient. And so God has mercy on all of us. Everyone that has come to Jesus has done and will do so because of the mercy of God. And so God is not caught off guard by his people rejecting him. In fact, he's used this rejection to reach any of us that have put our faith in him. And he will use our faith to reach his people. He's sovereign. He is in control. He hasn't rejected his people. He hasn't, and he won't reject you if you come to him. God keeps his promises. And so how do we move towards Jesus this week? As we leave here, be humble, be grateful. Realize that salvation is a gift from God. It's not something that you've earned. And let that realization lead you to humility and to gratitude. Follow Jesus in a way that draws others to him and help Crosswater do the same. Pray for the people around you that don't know Jesus. And then share the gospel with them. Let's pray. Lord, thank you that you don't give up on us. While we were still sinners, you died for us. And so I pray that we wouldn't be arrogant about our faith in you, that we wouldn't think that suddenly we've got all the answers and we've done everything right, but that we would be humble, that we would be grateful, that we would love people well, and that our following, our obedience to you would draw other people to you, Lord. And I pray that you would give us the boldness to share with other people, that we would point them to you, and that they would come to faith in you as a result. I pray this in your name. Amen.